Hello, you all, and welcome back to Mindful Nuggets with Tasha T. I am your host. Today, I am talking with Johanny Reyes. She is a licensed clinical social worker and therapist in the state of Florida who is of Afro Latina descent. Today, we are talking about grief. I don't know. I've had people in my life to die, and I've just had people around me who have experienced loss as well. So today we're going to talk about grief, some myths about grief, and how to support someone who might be dealing with grief. So keep listening and enjoy this episode today with Johanny Reyes. Good evening, Johanny. Thank you for taking time out to speak with me on the Mindful Nugget podcast. How are you doing this evening?
I am doing well. Thank you for having me, Tasha. How are you?
I am doing well. So I am just looking forward to talking with you about grief. But before we get started, could you tell the people a little about who you are?
I see my name is Johanny, and I'm a licensed therapist and social worker in the state of Florida. I am the founder and CEO of Thriving Counseling Solutions. We're specialized in treating young and professional women on learning how to manage mental health problems or mental health concerns related to depression, anxiety, grieving loss, relationship problems, and even trauma.
Oh my goodness, you are doing a lot of things. So, how did you get into the social work therapy field?
Was social work. I can say, I was born in the Dominican Republic, and when I came to this country, I was 9 years old when I came to this country, and I lived. I was raised by my mom,
Mm-hmm.
and when I migrated here with my grandparents, I we received social services assistance.
Mm-hmm.
So that's how I was introduced to social services. And I developed an interest for it, and I love working with people, and I saw the needs, and I lived it myself, and living in a low income home. So I say that's how I was attracted to the social work profession, and having dealt with family um, family problems, like for example, trauma, relationship problems. So I feel that I even felt that was something that caught my more of my attention. Says, when you live certain experiences, so it leads you to want to learn more about them. So
Right.
I say, that's how I was introduced to the social work profession and the clinical field.
Okay, so you had a time in your life where you were having to receive some social service support. So that just kind of got you curious about that, and you kind of just felt the need to give back to others in the same way that you had received that support.
Exactly. Now it's my time to help make a difference and provide that support to my community.
That is awesome. But how did you end up becoming a therapist?
Uh, so I went to school. I got a master's in social work,
Mm-hmm.
and I had an interest in working with children. So I started. I worked at a. I did my internship at a center where working with kids who were sexually molested.
Mm-hmm.
So the clinical aspect of it was something that always caught my attention. Like when I was little, I used to say, of course, after I came to this country, that I wanted to be a child psychologist. So
Oh,
when I was introduced to the clinical aspect of social work, I did an internship in a center, and that's how I was introduced, to the clinical side. So that's when I actually, dove right in. I used to work at a nursing and rehab center as a social worker, but I was
Mm-hmm.
also learning, the clinical aspect of it. So that's how I developed an interest on it.
Okay. And I actually wanted to be a clinical child psychologist myself. So we have that in common.
Oh, awesome.
Yeah. All right. So I just thought it would be good to talk about grief because there's just so many people who are experiencing grief right now. Um, so just kind of wanted to come on and just talk about grief. So can you just tell me, how does grief impact people?
Hmm. Grief can impact people in so many ways. It can impact them, emotionally, even physically, socially, and spiritually. For example, when someone is grieving, emotionally it affects them because it leads to sadness, anger, disbelief. So grief takes a toll in relation to the emotional aspect of it. And then socially, when someone is grieving, they tend to isolate
Yeah.
or withdraw.
Hmm.
And grieving, that aspect can also create conflict due to people having different grieving styles. So socially, sometimes people are grieving a certain way, and sometimes they are inclined to isolate just
Yeah.
because they may be grieving differently. And then physically, that it can take a toll on the body because grieving is exhausting. So there's fatigue involved in relation to physically. And then spiritually, grief can affect our relationship, even with God, because with our faith we may question due to the feelings of loss, and questions may arise in regards to losing a loved one.
Okay. So you have just really brought out some interesting points. Grief can impact you spiritually in your relationship with God. It can take a toll on you physically. It can impact you emotionally and mentally. So all those things, I would totally agree with that. Now, do you know much about Elizabeth Kubler-Ross? I think
Elizabeth? No, I don't.
yeah, so she's the one that had the 5 stages of
Oh,
grief.
yes, of course. With acceptance, depression, bargaining, anger,
Yeah,
denial. Yes.
yeah. So like you just kind of made it seem like that grief is just because with her, she talks about how grief impacts you emotionally, but you've identified that it impacts you more than emotionally. You talked about the
Yes.
physical, emotional, spiritual, all of that.
Yes.
So,
Yes. Definitely in every aspect of it.
yeah. So, how could someone deal with grief? So, I actually have this book and it has these myths about grief. I wanted to share three that stood out to me. One says that grief is a bad thing.
Hmm.
Um, so,
Not at all. So grief, it's not a bad thing. It's actually healthy,
mm-hmm,
because when we grieve, first of all, we are processing those feelings and emotions.
mm-hmm,
And in order for us to heal from grief or learn to accept it, it's important for us to grieve. So, grief is not a bad thing, it's actually a good thing because it helps us process our emotions and feelings, and it helps with healing. So,
okay.
no, grief is not a bad thing.
So grief is a healing thing and a human thing.
Yes.
The next one says you should keep busy and try to think about only pleasant things.
Another myth that it's not true, because with grief it's important to identify, and with the stages of grief there's acceptance.
Mm-hmm.
So it's important to look at the situation. Okay, I'm grieving. I'm not going to keep busy and try to think about other things, and the total opposite. It's important to feel those
Mm-hmm.
feelings in order to be able to heal from them. So,
Okay.
no, that's a myth.
Okay. All right. And the other one is when grief is resolved, it never comes up again.
Exactly. That's another myth, because grief, it's a process. So we may grieve for 6 months, a year, yet it may come back. Especially, for example, birthdays or special occasions that may remind us of our loved ones.
Hmm.
So when grief is resolved, it can come back.
Yeah, because I always say it's like when a person dies, it's as if a part of you has left with that person. So anytime you're reminded of that person, it does come back. So it
Yes.
might not impact you as much as it did when that person first transitioned or died. But as you,
Mm-hmm.
it,
Exactly.
yeah. So what are some ways that a person who might be grieving could work through that process of grief?
So they can either, normalize. One thing is to normalize those feelings. It's important to see that those feelings are normal in relation to grief, and also taking time to process those feelings, and that feeling of loss, either through talking to loved ones, or journaling, joining a support group, or a grief support group, and also reminding ourselves that grief is not linear, and that everyone grieves differently and at a different pace. So just because someone may be managing or dealing with it different than us, that doesn't make them, better than us, or us better than them. So it's important to remember that everyone grieves differently and at their own pace.
So are you saying I just shouldn't get over it?
Exactly. You should not, because it's not linear. Everyone has their own way of grieving, and that's okay.
Okay. So just normalize those emotions and remember that when it comes to grief, it's a unique experience, whatever that might mean for you.
Exactly.
Okay. Do you have any other tips?
I do. I want to say how it's important to support someone who's grieving, and sometimes we don't know what to do or what to say.
Yeah.
So something important to do is to take time to listen
Mm-hmm.
to the person who's grieving, and to also avoid giving advice that may be misinterpreted by the person who's grieving. Like, for example, the tendency to say they are in a better place.
Mm.
That can be triggering, because the person is grieving that their loved one is not physically here. And also to stay connected and available. Sometimes, we would say to people, reach out if you need something. But sometimes, with grief and how it can be exhausting, sometimes people may not have the energy to reach out. So maybe we want to take the initiative and reach out, or even ask how we can be of service to them. And also to remember to respect each person's way of grieving, because
Mm.
sometimes that can get in the way.
Yeah. So don't take somebody that fried chicken and collard greens and macaroni and cheese because that's what you would eat. But
Mhm.
identify what they might need.
Exactly. Exactly.
And they might not want food. They might just need somebody to come over and help clean their house up or something. That's
So to ask, yeah, ask open-ended questions. How can I be of service to you? What would you like me to do? Or do you need some space? Or you just ask.
because I think sometimes people might mean well, but with someone that they know dies, they might just they might do stuff to kind of make themselves feel good, and it becomes about the person giving the service versus the one who's receiving the service. So I think it's important too that people remember it's not all about them, but it's about the person
Ex-
grieving. So,
Exactly, exactly. So a constant reminder there that it's not about you.
hmm, yeah. So that was great. Well, yeah. So thank you for coming on to talk about grief. So how could people get in contact with you if needed?
Well, they can follow me on Instagram at Thriving Counseling Solutions, or they can visit my website. It's www.thrivingcounseling.solutions.com. And again, I'm in Florida. And I'm Johanny Reyes, and I'm licensed in Florida, so I see clients in Florida.
Okay. Well, before you leave, do you have any closing remarks for anyone who's grieving or those who might be supporting someone who's grieving?
I do. I do. I want to say that to keep in mind that grief is an expression of love,
Mm.
and that it's important to normalize those feelings and to also give yourselves permission to grieve in order to learn to adjust to living. And just a reminder that grief is an expression of love.
Oh, that is beautiful. Grief is an expression of love. What a way to end this podcast episode. I think so many people feel guilty for grieving. But when you're
Exactly.
grieving, like you said, it's just showing how much you loved and cared for that person. So thank you
Yeah,
for sharing that.
you're welcome. My pleasure.
All right. Well, thank you for your time. Thank you for being here. I have truly enjoyed this conversation. So I look forward to communicating with you later. Would you take care?
You're welcome, and thank you for having me.
You're welcome. All right. Bye bye.
Bye bye.
So, did you learn something new about grief from listening to this episode today? Please be sure to share this with someone in your life who might also benefit from learning a little more about grief. And please be sure to leave a comment regarding how this podcast episode has impacted you. Until next time, you all be mindful.